So the schedule said this was David Crane and Gary Kitchen, Activision video game designers. Something came up at the last minute. Gary was not able to come. He let me know about a week ago. And so I couldn't figure out if I could fill the time myself the way we normally do, which is to tell stories about the old days of making video games. So I actually did this presentation in the last week, so it's a never-before-seen presentation. I'm often asked, of all my games, which I have published very close to 100 games. I don't actually have a fixed number because every time I try to count them, I come up with different ones. I mean, in 35 years, 100 games, you forget it. You forget them after a while. I'm sorry. But anyway, so it's right around 100. And of course, here I am, having made 100 games, and everybody only knows me as Mr. Pitfall. But that's okay. But as I say, I'm often asked, what is my favorite game that I've ever done? And it's a tough question to answer because you have to love the game you're working on to be able to work on it the number of hours that we work on these games. But from both a creative and technical standpoint, Grand Prix is actually my favorite. You know that to create the games that we created on the Atari 2600 required tremendous technical wizardry, tricks that we had to perform that maybe 100 people in the world had even a clue that we had to do that sort of stuff to make these games. And 4 of us left Atari to form Activision, and now here we are, the upstart new company. We have to be better. In some way, we have to be better so that, this little company gets the attention that the behemoth Atari, doesn't just take away the attention from us. Also, when we were at Atari, one of the things that we could do is we could make home versions of their arcade games, and everybody had already played the arcade games, so they would just flock to the stores to buy the home version. And we didn't have any arcade games to make games of, so we had to be creative in everything we did. The Grand Prix was like my 5th game at Activision. It was either right before or right after Pitfall. Can't remember exactly. And the number of tricks that I had to go through to make this game possible was impressive, in my opinion, even by my standards. So I'm going to try to go through and show some of these things that I had to do. But I have to start with a little bit of a primer and a tutorial on how the 2600 works. Probably only about 3 people out there who don't already know all this stuff, but for those 3, okay, I'm going to go through briefly what happened. The Atari 2600 was made by Atari so that they could make home games of their arcades, really. And Joe DeCure and his team worked on a chip. And basically, the idea was to make a system that could make Tank and Pong by changing cartridges. And anything else you get is kind of gravy. So the hardware that does those things, if you could use that hardware in different ways, that's great. So the 2600 is kind of well suited to look at the Tank display to see what it's capable of doing. And you see it's got score at the top. It's basically got 2 high-resolution players, the 2 tanks. Each one of those has a missile the same color as the tank. So the green tank can shoot the green missile, blue tank the blue missile. And then it has this chunky, low-resolution play field that looks a lot like the arcade tank layout, where you had to drive around things in order to get a clear shot. But the way the 2600 works, it didn't just display that object on the screen. It displayed 8 bits of graphics in a particular horizontal position. And if you turn them on at the top, it would just make a stripe all the way down. So now the program had to go through, and every single scan line of the TV, it had to change what graphics were written into that object. So basically in the tank, after you've done the score at the top, you start this play field where you're writing zeros to the player until the code determines it's time to start putting out the tank. Then you write the graphics from the ROM into the object, and then you write zeros afterwards. So if you write fewer zeros, it shows up higher. You can basically move the thing up and down. The horizontal position is set by the hardware, and it was designed to be set during the non-visible portion of the screen. We've got about a third of our processing time takes place when there's no picture being displayed. It's called vertical retrace on a TV. It's while the scan is being electromagnetically moved up back to the top to start the next screen. And so the horizontal position was one of those things that would be done once every 60th of a second in the non-visible, but then the graphics had to be done every single scan line of the TV. Then this hardware was handed to the creative team, and Larry Kaplan, among others, wrote Air Sea Battle. Now, Air Sea Battle, all of a sudden, we don't have 2 tanks anymore. We have 6 or 7 moving objects. We've got the traditional score still at the top, and the 2 objects down there, there's the green howitzer and the orange howitzer, which the green howitzer shot a green missile, and the orange howitzer an orange missile, right? And then we have these bands in which there's the other player object, one of the player objects gets repositioned multiple times down the screen horizontally so that it can exist in these bands that would move independently. Now pay particularly note to the black line along the left side of the screen. And Joe has his talk later. You can ask him why he didn't fix this bug. But it was really one of those things that it wasn't intended that you would ever position the player during the visual part of the screen. This is supposed to be done during setup when the screen was not being displayed. So the fact that the hardware actually doesn't allow pixels to be output to the television for about 8 pixels worth there during a reset, a positional reset, didn't bother anybody. I'm sure the minute he saw that, he wanted to fix it, and we're all glad he didn't. All right, and I'll explain why that is later. But so basically, when you're looking at a 2600 screen, if you can see the little lines along the left side of the screen, you know that some object is being repositioned. In this particular case, it's the one object that represents the airplanes and the Atari blimp at the bottom there. See, as I could have been marching through my little presentation here and talking at the same time. There's also, this is kind of the first time that there's another object that passes through these horizontal bands. So each missile of each player can travel through each band. But if you look at any one horizontal band, you can have 2 players that are 8 bits and one of 3 one-dot objects, 2 missiles or a ball. And that's all you can have in any horizontal position. But when we composite these screens together, you don't notice that as a player. You don't say, oh, look, you can't have 2 players at the same place, on the same line. Joe did a lot of other things in this hardware that, you wonder what he was thinking. But it didn't take very much circuitry to make this happen. And that is that any one of those objects has the ability to have multiple copies of it repeated horizontally. Now it's the same graphics repeated, and also you can get each pixel is 2 pixels of visual and 4 pixels. So each dot of the hardware can be 2 or 4 pixels. And in Air Sea Battle, they used that for a squadron of biplanes. So you have these 3 biplanes flying around. And they also shoot 3 missiles, as I recall. So it's just kind of a cute little thing. And if he hadn't done that, the Atari 2600 would have been dead about 13 years before its final demise. We used this technique, particularly the multiple sprite technique, in every game made after 1980. So thanks for that cute little piece of hardware. For the Grand Prix screen, since I've promised to deconstruct it, I'm going to show kind of how the Grand Prix screen is assembled using that hardware that we know of. So first there's a band of about 10 lines of dirt. This is just brown, one of the light brown colors that the 2600 is capable of. And in that, I'm going to use both of the players replicated in its 3 repeats, or 2 repeats, 3 copies, and set them horizontally so that they make this set of bushes on the screen. The next group is the main part of the screen. I set the background color to gray, but I want to call attention to the black line between the brown and the gray. That is not just intentional, it's a big deal. If you recall, I said at Activision we felt we had to do something to make our games look better. And one of the things that we did is what you see here. And the net result was people would look at the game and say, I had people come up to me every trade show and say, why do your games look so much better than Atari's? And they can't figure out why, but they could see it. They could see that there was something crisper, nicer, better. And part of that was the color selection. We didn't use the odd fuchsia and other things that the colors, the 2600 could use. We limited ourselves to primary colors and very nice looking, pseudo-realistic colors. But this one little black line is such a big deal. Couple issues. We're talking 1979, 80, this is maybe 81, 82, this game. And as Al Elkhorn just explained, there weren't monitors the way we think of them today. There certainly weren't LCD monitors as we think of them today. Everything was television sets. And I will go a little bit into television theory, might put some people to sleep, but television was a very interesting animal created in the late 40s, early 50s, whenever it was. Black and white television was a very specific system and had a particular bandwidth, and it could make certain types of dots and pixels. Then RCA went nuts and made color TV. And they had to make color TV work with existing black and white transmitters and stations and everything, because those were already existed for like 10 years when they brought out color TV. So they added a circuit into a color TV that did colors on top of a black and white picture. Unlike today, you have an LCD display. You can have each dot of that LCD can be one of a million colors. That's not the way it works with color TV back in the tube days. Basically, as the picture was being scanned, its brightness, its luminance, was using the black and white standard and making black and white pixels. And then there was a color wash being applied. It's much lower resolution. But you don't notice because your eye looks for detail. And so when you look at a color TV, particularly back in those days, real early days, you didn't notice that a red shirt actually bloomed way outside the outlines of the shirt. Quarter an inch sometimes. You don't notice it because your eye sees the shirt and it sees the edge in the black and white aspect of the picture. So colors were, by definition, lower resolution. They didn't exist on every pixel. And with old TVs, those colors bloomed badly. You would get mixes of colors. You'd try to put blue next to red, and you get this god-awful purple that happens in between there. Knowing that, when we started Activision, monitors were available, but we decided not to use them. We went out to Montgomery Ward's, and we bought their cheapest 19-inch color TVs, because that's going to be like the TV that you have in your house. And so quite often I used the fact that TVs would have this blending and artifacting in the art that I created. If you look at the Mad Bomber in Kaboom, which is one of the characters I created, in order to try to give some definition between his chest and his arm, I left a crosshatch of pixels out, which let the gray background show through. And it turns out that you can't just turn one pixel on and off and get a real solid dot. So if you leave just one empty pixel like that, it tended to blur. And your eye said, oh, it looks like he's got an arm and it looks like he's got a body. But if you look at the graphics now or in the emulators, why is it a zigzag? you would ask. Well, look at it on a TV and it looks really nice. So we took advantage of that kind of thing. Well, this is the opposite. By putting an extra black line there, I made a very sharp delineation between the bushes and the dirt and the gray of the race track. Otherwise, it would not look as crisp. You wouldn't know why. You would look at it and say, gee, it seems kind of blurred, fix the focus on the TV. And that took an extra whole step. But I'm showing you how I'm assembling this screen out of bands of technology. That black line is actually a band. It's another band I had to think about and program into this thing. On top of the road is where all the cars go. Now in this game, we've got, my car is the red car and I can go anywhere. And then there are 4 bands of the other player being reused for the opposing cars. And you see the little black line on the left edge. That shows you that the player's been repositioned. So the position that the player was for the yellow car then gets repositioned to where it has to be for the blue car. Then we have to do black line, then dirt, then bushes, and then the timer. Now that timer is, it's all the players and missiles and everything being used. You can see the players are being used. We used to do this a lot. We'd stand around and say, okay, we got that, so there's my 6 digits, and then I can put the missile here for a colon and missile here for a dot or whatever. So a lot of effort went into making that kind of a display so that it could display hundredths of a second through the game. And then the Activision trademark. Bob Whitehead just did that once before our first game got released, and everybody says, that's so cool, just got to have it. And later it got changed to the angled A logo, then it got the rainbow added to it, then it displayed a copyright message. I mean, once you've got it there, you can do a lot of stuff with it, but that is at the bottom of the screen in every game. Occasionally somebody would ask, but if you took that away, you'd have more screen to play with. Yeah, but we can also just design the game to fit and have it there too. Let's see. So we got those black lines, and as I said, it was really nice that Joe didn't fix this hardware, or let me rephrase that. Atari was too cheap to go back and make the hardware again with any fixes in it. That's accurate, yeah. So if you look at the yellow car, we got a problem here. The Atari hardware was designed so that if you tried to display a pixel, 1 pixel off the right edge, it shows up on the left edge. So there was hardware wraparound for sprite objects, which is great when you got a jet plane flying through the sky and he just goes off one end and he comes back on the other, and or like asteroids, the way the game worked, it just used hardware wraparound. It's great if that's the kind of game that you want, but it can be a real problem that you have to deal with if that's not what you want. So one of the things, we at Activision, again, we were trying to make things look better. So that little black line really pissed us off. We just would not let a game go out with those black lines. And one way to do that is to make the glitch happen on every line of the screen. You can invoke the movement hardware, but set the movement amount to 0. All right, so it thinks it's moving one of the objects every single scan line, but its movement amount is set to 0. And so now look at that, we've got this beautiful smooth edge. Same person who complained about the logo says, but wait a minute, now you're not using 8 pixels on the left side of the screen, you could do more if you were over there. I said, yeah, but we don't like those lines and we're covering them up. So that's basically how the overall screen was built. But the key to this game is the cars. I should have done it. I kept wanting to go back to Stella and copy the car out of Indy 500, which was an Atari cartridge, that had cars going around in circles and such. I wanted to put the Indy 500 car next to the to my Grand Prix car, because the Indy 500 car would be the size of the back tire, between the front of the back tire and the back of the blue. That's how big the Indy 500 car was. That's how big an 8-pixel object would be in the screen, and it would look stupid, right? Creating this car took 6 or 8 weeks of experimentation, logicking it out. So I'm going to zoom in on the screen and look at how this car was built. What you see on the left there is the ROM image. So it's 8 pixels by, I don't know, I think it's 30 lines long. And the player one, assume he's positioned kind of where those yellow marks are. So what I do is I read from the ROM and write the first 4 lines, just as if that was an 8-bit player the size of the Indy 500 car. Then I set that player one object to be one of those multiple copies and write the next 4 lines or 5 lines. And now what you'll see is they're showing up twice, and they're the same exact pixels. All right? So I took advantage of that so that I could have a big fat tire on the back and a narrow tire on the front, like some Grand Prix cars have. I don't know, maybe back in the old days. Then set it to quad, so each dot on the left is 4 visible pixels on the right. And give it, 6 bits are on. And that makes the left side of the car. Same thing quad, I do the rest of the middle. And you'll see 1 pixel left off on the left side becomes the big square, which is the cockpit. That if I didn't have that, there would be no detail where you might imagine a driver would be. But you'll notice it's an off pixel, which means it shows the road through. It's not another color, it's the road showing through to make it look like another color. And then reverse that process. And so that squashy little thing back there that I had to draw on pixel paper, we took quad ruled paper and we colored them in with pencils and figured out how this was going to look, becomes that when I changed the 2x, 4x thing that we had available to us as we go down on every scan line. And if I'm going to change every scan line, change something on every scan line, I also change the color on every scan line. So now we can see we leave the tires black, we have a white axle to look kind of silverish against the gray, and then shade it up with a gradient, do a racing stripe, shade it down with a gradient, and then fender, axle, tire, and then you've got your car. So that was a lot of effort, just showing how detailed the level we had to go through just to make something look like this, given the hardware that we were limited to. Even though we loved the hardware, it was very limiting. So now, there are some pixels missing on the tires, and the reason they're missing is to show tire tread and ultimately animate the tire tread. So again, the left side is the ROM image, and I copied these right out of the ROM, by the way. I mean, made it easier since I knew they existed. And the best way to animate when you're dealing with small resolution digital like this is steps of 3. If you try to animate with 2, it's going to look like it's just blinking back and forth. But if you do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, you're good. And you just have to make sure you limit the animation speed so that you never move more than 1.0 pixels or images, or it starts to go backwards, because it would immediately start to look at 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1 if you added 2 to each one. But anyway, so there we have the width being used, the double copy being used, color per line being used, multiple pictures to create this animation, even though, again, they are missing pixels, which means the road is showing through, but when you watch the game, you don't see that. You just see it as detail. So we're done, right? Well, not exactly. We have this other problem. Now, right now, I don't have the movement glitches over here on the side, and I'm going to simulate right edge and left edge, even though I've zoomed in on the screen. This is a simulation of what the 2600 would do at the edges of each screen, right? So if I wanted to have a car advancing on me from behind, I would put it over here where you can just see the nose sticking out and start to have it scroll onto the screen. Well, if I did that, over on the right side of the screen would be the whole rest of the car. It's kind of like you look at a moose head on the wall and you want to go around the other side and see the whole moose. You know, that's what you get with a 2600. So even if you turn on or put the glitch on every line, it just ain't doing it. It's not enough. So what do? Well, we do this, and it's a complicated screen, but it's basically, again, on the left is a picture from the ROM, and on the right is the car that it creates using the width options and other things like that. So in order for, well, because I have the glitch, I've got about 8 pixels at the left side of the screen that I can hide anything behind. Nothing will be displayed there. So I can go off the screen by 8 pixels, but if I go off the screen by 9 pixels, it'll start to show up on the left screen. So when I'm about to draw a car, I can draw a car 8 pixels off, but I want to move him off a little farther, and as soon as I'm about to draw him 9 pixels off the screen, I have to switch his graphics to the second one in the left column, which doesn't have a nose in the picture, if you see. Then when he's about to be 17 pixels off, I switch to the third one, which doesn't have even a body, just has a little bit past the cockpit. And then the last 16 pixels plus, of course, those aren't making a second copy of the tire, or they'd be floating out there in space also. So each one of these requires a complete custom designed car graphic times 3, because each and every one of them has to have that same version but with 3 tire pictures. So the top left and the bottom right are the same. I'm just showing the sequence. So there are 7 distinct car pictures times 3, so there's 21 blocks of these 32 bytes in the ROM just to make the cars smoothly move on and off the screen. We were anal that way. It's true. So we're not done. This is a simulation of the red car, which is me, moving throughout the game. If you remember, back in those days, we liked to make game options. Some of them were ridiculous. 256 game options. We sit here 256 times, on the game select. Grand Prix had 4, and it was 4 successively longer tracks. And the first track did not have a bridge over water, but 2, 3, and 4 did. But how do I make the bridge? I mean, I've gone pretty nuts already making bushes, cars, colors, sizes, the whole thing, just to make that basic screen. So now we've got to make a bridge. Well, we haven't used yet the playfield. Picture the tank picture that has those big squares. We haven't used those yet. And we use those rarely until we really had to, because they were low resolution. The closest resolution, or the highest resolution they could do, is 4 pixels per dot. So if you try to do something like I'm doing here, which is smoothly moving, you can't do that with playfield. So what is the blue? Well, the blue is the playfield, and you'll notice there's a black line between the blue and the gray. All right, that's the playfield color. It's actually superimposed over the gray, But because of what your eye does for it, it makes it look like it's a river and the bridge is above it, right? So by making that black line, I give you an illusion of depth. And of course, I eliminate the bloom and I make it really a crisp display. But the playfield can't scroll smoothly like you just saw this scrolling smoothly. Well, there's another object we haven't used yet, and that's the ball object, which is the same color as the playfield. And coincidentally, it can be 4 pixels wide, 8 pixels wide. It can be made 1, 2, 4, or 8, I think. So it can be fatter using that same kind of circuitry that we've already used before. So I'm going to dim out the ball object. And what you see here is the ball object becomes the leading and then trailing edge of the water. And the ball object can be moved at single pixel resolution. So if it were done like this, that's what you would see. That's the playfield waiting 3 pixels before moving 4. Wait 3, move 4. Wait 3, move 4. And moving the ball object smoothly to cover up that 4-bit resolution mess. All right? That's not all. What good is having a black line between the dirt and the road and between the water and the road if you don't have a black line between the road and the water going that way? So that's yet another object. That is the player's missile. The player object that's used for the 4 cars. Its missile is turned on at the bottom of the brown and at the end of the blue to make this black line. That's the hardest line to make in this entire game right there. Largely because, if you remember, the car player object is colored. It's got a rainbow color to it. So this is black, and the missile takes on the color of the player. So if you had a car sitting up here above my red car, that black line to the blue water would actually be rainbow colored. It would have the racing stripe on it, just like the car. So cars can never get close to the bridge, those other cars. Now there's a good reason not to do that too, because they're in 4 fixed bands and they would just drive right over the water, and that would look really bad too, right? So besides the fact that that I needed that object to be black, I still had to make the cars not be near the bridge. So that gets into actually gameplay and game coding, which we'll go into in a little bit. Now the other thing that you'll notice, we'll do some gameplay footage later and you'll look for them there. There are oil slicks in the game. So when this game is running, I'm actually seeding cars over here on the right side at a speed slower than you, so that they will slide onto the screen, and then if you pass them, they'd slide off the screen. So the maze, if you will, of cars that you're going after is being generated on the fly through an algorithm using a polynomial pseudorandom counter as the game is being played. And occasionally I will also throw out an oil slick, which if you hit the oil slick, it causes you to spin around. It usually causes you to run into another car if you play the game. That's not intentional, it just tends to happen with a car, with a game that is as tight as this one. But so sometimes I can use these objects to output oil slicks, but I also use the 4 objects as the checkered flag for the finish. So you've seen how how my car is built, how the 4 cars were built, how the bridge is smooth, oil slicks, finish line, all use the same objects. And just to get to this point, as I said, took some 8 weeks just to get the display to work. And finish, that pun is intended, this is supposed to be the finish, but I added gameplay footage afterward. I don't know how we're doing for time, but let's let this run. So as you can see, the cars are being fed in generally from the right, and if they're moving slower than you, they're going to move from right to left. You'll also notice that your car, the red car, is moving up and down, but it's not moving left and right. The effect of moving forward is generated by moving the bushes to the left. And so again, it's all an illusion. Plus the cars move on the screen. The other cars, based on their difference in speed to your speed. And this is me playing the game at 2 o'clock in the morning 2 days ago, using Stella and arrow keys. So, you know, and some of those collisions are intentional. A lot of people don't realize. I had a story that explains this, but if you get heavily into a video game, you have a suspension of reality where the video game world is the real world to you now, all right? And you have to remember that all it really is pixels. So any simulation of physics is a function of code written by the programmer. It's just not in there otherwise. I did a game called Canyon Bomber, and in Canyon Bomber, this is when I was at Atari, you would drop bombs down into a valley, and if your bomb hit a brick, it knocked out the brick like Breakout, and you get points. And then if you undercut a brick, the bricks would fall to fill the hole. And it was a coin-op game, so I was following somebody else's rules anyway. It was harder to get those bricks to fall than the rest of it, to basically have a bomb take out a brick like Breakout. I mean, that's a dot hits a box, take out the box. Now you've got to do a calculation with gravity that lets things fall. And Canyon Bomber was done. They were going to write a manual for it, so a couple girls came over from marketing services and asked me to show them the game, and I'm explaining all this game. And turns out that one of the options later in the choices of options are to turn off gravity so that the bricks don't fall, which actually changes the whole game, because now you've got patterns. If you hit a zigzag here, you can hit a zigzag just short, or a little bit left of it, and take out a whole row that's still floating up in the air. It's a different game logic, but I'm demonstrating these things so that these ladies can write the manual. And I go into this game, and I drop a bomb, and I drop the bomb, and it hits the bricks, and it knocks out the bricks, and the others don't fall. And they both gasp, and one of them looks at me and says, "How did you get them to stay up like that?" As I said, and you don't think of it, that you need to write. If you're going to collide with something, you've got to write code that collides with it. If you're going to, two objects can, on the screen, exist in the same space, where in reality they can't. So you have to write code that does that. And when you're looking at the Grand Prix collision, you'll actually see that in many cases, code has to be written to make the car. Now I don't run into anything. To push the car out of coexisting with other cars. And of course, it flashed the screen red. It seemed cool. In the first pass of this game, I should have pointed it out then, but we got near the first water bridge, and I stopped seeding cars, and I started seeding only oil slicks. One of the tricks to make sure that there aren't any cars on the screen when the bridge gets there, all right? So as much as I could, I would seed only oil slicks, because oil slicks have no speed, so they move off the screen from wherever they're placed. They don't exist, don't continue to hang around. But that's not perfect, because there is a scenario where you can make an effort, as I will do here, to keep this car on the screen. So one screen short of the bridge, all the other cars slam on their brakes and get out of the way. So that's basically it. Let me let this run and take any questions. Yes?
You said it was a pseudo-random generator to generate the opposing cars, but the layout I'm sure you have that there is a maze to drive through and it's a consistent maze. So like top speed the whole way to neutral just right. Did you design and lay out that maze, or did it just come about from the random number generator?
It's just from the random number generator, but you're absolutely right. If you play the game the same way twice, you will have the same exact maze. That's why I call it pseudo-random. We use this thing called a polynomial counter, which is really, instead of having a counter that counts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it counts in a random sequence. And that told me what color car, whether it's an oil slick or not, and which of the four places to put it. And that decision is being made about, I don't know, about probably every bush as you're traveling, which is why you can have two coming up close and whatever. And I haven't looked at what the world record is in Grand Prix. I may still hold it, but I wasn't being timed or whatever, because there was a way on game one that you could play a perfect game down to the last car, and you had to hit the brakes a little bit and wait for two cars to separate to go between them, because the other lanes were blocked. So the only way to get through at high speed was to slow down a little bit. And that was the world record for the longest time. And watching it, I felt like there's one pixel that might allow a car to get through there without slowing down. So at one CES, when we were demonstrating these games in the suite, I just sat down and for 4 hours I played this thing over. 30 seconds for 4 hours, right? And I got through on one of them and proved that it could be done. And when I did, I was going so fast that there was time for another car to be seated, and it was right in the lane I was in. And so I did this perfect thing, and I said, "Yay, crash!" You know. So then I had to go for another couple hours to do it again, and change lanes, because it does slow your car down to change lanes. It's one of the tweaks that's in here. So every time you change lanes, because you're traveling laterally, you lose a little bit of speed, so you can lose a little bit of time. So if you're trying to go for a perfect game, you want to move as little as possible, find the least amount of moves. So that's why I left it alone at the end, thinking I'm not going to do any more moves and I'm going to get the best score ever. But ran into another car. So, like I said, I don't know if the world record held by Todd Rogers or whoever. Yeah, I just don't know if he made that turn or not, made that last thing. But I know it's possible because I did it. So yeah, pseudo-random, repeatable, but all bets are off. As soon as you have a crash, if you've memorized the course, just start over. Because you're not going to get the same, the rest of it's not going to be any practice whatsoever. Any other questions? We have one here.
Yeah, you mentioned physics. I was just curious about, I'm assuming you didn't have floating point, and probably didn't have multiply. I was curious about your physics library, how you guys did that, if you shared them, how that worked.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. Remember, we had, for this game, we had 4K bytes of ROM. So there wasn't room for a library to do anything, any kind of a library. We had 128 bytes of RAM. No floating point, everything was 8-bit. We couldn't even, in most cases, share code. There was a couple pieces of code that we would share for repositioning players, for example. In fact, Joe had written it, and it was a loop and a modulo and a remainder type thing. That's what you called it, yes. And that we used for the longest time until Steve Cartwright finally said, look, it's 160 positions. All I need is a 160 byte table. He said, don't tell me I need to do this calculation and waste all this time. Because we were always trading off CPU time, ROM, and memory and RAM. And as the ROMs got bigger, we actually made some different trade-offs and did that sort of thing. But for the bricks falling in Canyon Bomber, it was hilarious. I mean, I took a piece of paper and I wrote 16 feet per second squared and floating point calculation and said, I'm going to make this fall like this. And then I scribbled that out and I did this and I did that. And I had like pages and pages of scribbled out stuff. And the whole thing came down to 2 lines of assembly language. And basically it was and maybe 3. It was an and, an or, an exclusive or. So basically looping through from the bottom, if there was a hole, I anded that to the one above, which made the brick go away, or the inverse of it down here, which made the brick reappear, and then finished the loop. And then the next time through, it found a different hole that I'd left behind. And so it was a running loop so that the things would cascade and fall. And literally, it was an or, an and, an or, an exclusive or. About all, the whole thing. Oh. I got time for one more. For the sound, the chip designers had put in the only sounds that we had available were there was a triangle wave, I think, which is a nice, clean sounding tone. Wasn't it a triangle?
No, square waves.
We had square. The polynomial counter made the crash sounds. It was just a random sound. And then there were square waves. But I thought OC was so smooth and clean sounding, I thought maybe it was a triangle. But anyway, it was very limited. And we would just randomly play with the variables and the frequencies and such and say, oh, that sounds pretty good. The only story I can remember about that was working in a lab with Carol Shaw while she was doing River Raid. And we had done this so much that the sounds that we created were algorithmic, let's put it that way. We had to write a program that used hardware in such a way to make a sound good. And we had to make it custom every single time. So she said, what should I do when I'm low on fuel and I want to have kind of an alarm? And I called across the lab and I from memory, I wrote her 12 lines of code that she put in, and that was the thing that went, there was an algorithm of changing the frequency to get that noise. Everything that we had to do was figure it out new, fresh, and go from it. We didn't have, this was before Photoshop, this was before QualiPad was the first pad that artists could use to draw pictures, and that was 5 years later, 6 years later. No tools whatsoever is the simple answer to that. All righty. Thank you.